Imagine being told you only have 12 months to live. That happened to Dr. Buteyko when he was only 29 years old in medical school. He then went on to cure diseases just by changing the way his patients breathed.
This shook up the entire medical industry and even led to several assassination attempts on Dr. Buteyko's life.
Before we get into it, let's take a deeper look at who was Dr. Buteyko.
Konstantin Pavlovich Buteyko was born in Ivanitsa, which is about 100 miles from Kiev in modern-day Ukraine, on January 27, 1923.
He grew up to become a Russian medical doctor and clinical physician. He received his medical degree from Moscow Medical Institute, where he studied from 1946 to 1952.
As a part of his medical training, Dr. Buteyko monitored the breathing patterns and rates of terminally ill patients prior to death.
After hundreds of hours spent observing and recording breathing patterns, he was able to predict with accuracy, often to the minute, the time of death of each patient.
He could tell how many days, hours, and even minutes were left in someone's life just based on their breathing.
One thing that he noted was that a patient's death was almost always preceded by an increased breathing rate, faster and erratic breaths.
While he was enrolled in university, he was diagnosed with malignant hypertension, a fatal form of blood pressure which gave him a life expectancy of just 12 months.
He consulted with the leading doctors at the time, and they told him that there was nothing he could do to reverse the disease. He was condemned to a life of sickness and early death.
Now keep in mind, he's only in his late 20s at this point. He spent years observing terminally ill patients, and suddenly he's become one of them.
But he continues on, researching mainly hypertension, which is like high blood pressure caused by stress. So that's where his direct experience lied. And in 1952, he finally graduated from the university with honors.
It was shortly after his graduation that he made a groundbreaking discovery, one that would not only change and save his own life, but the lives of countless others.
The story goes like this. It was October 7th, 1952. Buteyko's health was rapidly declining. He was experiencing constant headaches, pain in the lower back and chest, low energy, and shortness of breath.
He looked at himself in the mirror and he realized he was breathing in the same way as the terminally ill patients he had been observing. Deep, haggard breaths, his shoulders visibly moving up and down with each inhale and exhale, and his chest was slightly caved in. He straightened up his upper torso, gently pulled his shoulders back, and he took slow and even inhales through his nose, followed by gentle exhales, relaxing the diaphragm at the end of each breath. Within minutes, his pain completely disappeared.
It seemed too good to be true, so he consciously returned his breath to his old pattern, breathing deeply and quickly through the mouth, chest breathing, and his pain returned immediately, so he switched back to slow and relaxed nasal breathing, and the pain disappeared once more.
It's been said by some that this was one of the greatest, although largely unacknowledged, medical discoveries of the 20th century, that the breath is more deeply linked to health and disease than we realized.
Now, before we dive into his work, the results, and some of the more mysterious circumstances surrounding the research, it's important that we address a little of the science behind what's going on here.
Dr. Buteyko wasn't just acting on a whim when he changed his breathing patterns. Remember, he was a trained medical doctor, and he had spent most of his years of training studying terminal illness and the breath. He also had a firm understanding of his own illness and its causes.
Through his observations of dying patients, he knew that hyperventilation, that is, breathing quickly and deeply, an erratic breathing pattern, worsened the health of patients while breathing more slowly caused them to eliminate their symptoms.
He also knew that the levels of CO2, carbon dioxide, in his own blood was far lower than normal, and it was common knowledge at the time among doctors that chronic hyperventilation, or overbreathing, lowers CO2.
Buteyko put these two pieces of the puzzle together, concluding that certain diseases may develop as a result of chronic overbreathing and could potentially be reversed by adopting a slower, more shallow breathing pattern.
Now, you may be thinking about all the times you've heard the advice, take a deep breath. Or maybe you've even practiced breathwork before, where you take deep and relatively fast breaths.
What we're talking about here is chronic overbreathing with poor form. Breathing through the mouth and into the chest, not engaging the diaphragm, and taking in more air than necessary day after day after day.
And get this, overbreathing is far more common today than it was just 100 years ago.
According to breath expert and researcher James Nestor, our average air consumption has increased from 5.25 liters of air per minute in the 1930s to over 9 liters per minute today.
Most of this has to do with the changing shape of our mouths, jaws, and faces. And if you really want to dive deep into that, we recommend reading Breath, The New Science of the Lost Art by the aforementioned James Nestor. And that's linked up directly in the description of this video.
So back to our story. Dr. Buteyko has this aha moment in the mirror. He changes his breath and it changes his life. Afterwards, he became so obsessed with the idea that overbreathing was causing these illnesses.
Today we understand that his theory of overbreathing has some scientific merit. We know that diseases like heart disease, ulcers, chronic inflammation, they're all linked to disturbances in circulation, blood pH, metabolism. How we breathe affects all of those functions.
But in the 1950s, this was completely unheard of, and Dr. Buteyko understood that he would need some serious evidence before he'd get any acceptance from his peers.
First, he started working on himself. He trained himself in proper breathing form and technique with a focus on more shallow and less erratic nasal breathing. This effectively cut down his overall liters of air per minute significantly.
Within a short period of time, he was completely healed. His blood pressure, CO2, and oxygen levels all returned to normal, and his persistent pain disappeared.
But one anecdotal case would hardly be enough to sway anyone, especially since the patient was himself.
So he started by working with one of the most common breathing conditions on the planet, asthma.
He was relatively unsurprised to find that most asthma patients were chronically overbreathing between their asthma attacks.
Over the course of a few years, working out of the Central and Lenin medical libraries, Dr. Buteyko devised a program to measure breathing, as well as a method of reconditioning patients' breathing patterns.
It mostly involved switching completely from mouth breathing to nasal breathing. There was also a focus on learning to relax the diaphragm after an exhale and keeping it relaxed until an air shortage was felt.
There was also a number of small lifestyle changes meant to assist the patient further in healing, including sleep protocols and proper hydration.
During this time, he started to draw a bit of attention to himself and his work. Fellow doctors and clinicians would scoff at his work, and already the mainstream medical world began to write him off as a pseudoscientist.
But Buteyko didn't care, and from 1958 to 1959, he conducted clinical trials of using his breath training approach on a mixed group of 200 people, some sick and some healthy.
On January 11, 1960, he demonstrated to the scientific forum at the Institute the clear correlation between depth of breathing, carbon dioxide levels in the body, and the state of health.
His research was largely rejected. One colleague even accused him of playing dirty tricks and called his experiments fraudulent.
The problem was that Buteyko's research directly challenged many of the theories upon which medicine was based. At that time, and still largely today, conventional medicine only looks to surgery and extensive medication as the path to curing disease.
It was inconceivable to the medical community that something as simple as a change in breathing patterns could have such a dramatic effect on health and disease.
But despite all of that, one thing went right for Dr. Buteyko on that frigid January day in 1960.
Hey there, Jake here. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you want to see the full video, you can head over to our YouTube channel. And if you want to stay up to date with stories like these and get our latest exercises, you can find all of that information with the link in our bio. Thanks so much for watching.